Hey guys, I'm Yancey. This story is all about what if Naruto was adopted by a goddess. A blonde-haired boy wakes up in a world he has never seen before. With only a note from his new mother as his guide, he tries to start a new life in this new world and discover his true heritage. Little did he know, he will be stuck in between a feud that could mean the end of the world. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 1, New World, New Life. My head hurts. A blonde-haired boy slowly opens his eye and found himself staring a ceiling he has never seen before. He groggily and slowly sat up to look around, and he did not recognize the place he was in. It was a nice room to begin with, a cabinet on the side of the room. There was a TV on its stand facing the bed. To the right, there was a nightstand with a lamp on it. Further to the right of the bed, there is a balcony terrace next to the window. He decides to stand up and look around. He checked the cabinet and found clothes that were his size and a bunch of scrolls with notes attached to them. He went to the TV to check it out, but he couldn't figure out how to turn it on, not knowing that you have to plug it in first. He went over to the balcony window to look out. What he saw made mind blow. He saw buildings so tall they were poking up the clouds. He saw moving objects that he thought they were carriages pulled by horses, except, the odd thing was there were no horses pulling it. He sat back down on the bed, still reeling from all the weird things he saw. He lay back down on the bed a little hard, only to have a note flutter down to his face. He picked it up and read what was written. Dear Naruto, I'm sorry I could not wait for you to wake up, but I'm afraid you cannot see me until the time is right. I know about your childhood and how hard it is to live all alone like that, so I took you in. I'm so sorry I couldn't get you sooner, but you're here now. That is what is important. I can tell you who your parents are though. Your father is the man you have looked up to and have been chasing all your life, Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage of the Leaf. Your mother is Kushina Uzumaki, the former Jinchuriki of the Nine-Tailed Fox. Don't blame them for leaving you on your own. It's not their fault. They died on the day you were born, protecting you and the village from the Nine-Tailed Fox's attack. They are heroes. I am telling you this for you to know that you were loved and you were not left alone. This time though I will be watching over you. Well, enough of that. If you didn't notice yet, you are in a different world from where you were. You have to start over again. I have some stuff for you. In the nightstand, there are some books on this world. You will need to read up on them to survive in this world. In the cabinet, you will find some clothes I picked up for you, so you could fit in with the people. There are also scrolls in there to help you in practicing your jutsu. In the drawer of the nightstand, there is some money for you to spend in this world and a map of the city so you can explore. I know you have a lot of questions. I assure you they will be answered in time. You will just have to be patient. Also, kids your age still have to go to school, so I enrolled you to a boarding school, Yancey Academy. I heard you loved learning, so I see you would not have a problem with this. Unfortunately, you will have to be careful of using your jutsu out in the open. People in this world have no knowledge of parallel worlds or special powers. That is all for now, my boy. Just know that I love you as my own and I will be watching over you. Love. Your new mother. P.S. You will have to brush up on Greek mythology. I guarantee it will come in handy in the future. A single tear ran down the side of his cheek. He was crying tears of joy because this time he felt loved. He was happy to know his parents loved him and didn't abandon him as what the villagers have been telling him all his childhood. He was happy to know that somebody took him in despite his past and how the villagers saw him. He was happy that this time, he would make new friends without them judging him for what was sealed inside of him. At the same time, he was sad that he had to leave the friends he had already made back in the Leaf Village. He was scared of what he may face ahead of him. He broke himself out of his thoughts and decided to stand up. He took a deep breath, ready to take on this new world he was in. With one big shout, he said, "Watch out world, because Naruto Uzumaki is here." Chapter 2, A Furious Encounter. It was not easy to live in a new world with no idea of what you are doing. The first thing Naruto learned in this new world was to follow the traffic lights. On that one occasion, he was almost hit by a car accidentally because he was reading a book he took a liking to, and he absent-mindedly crossed the street. Thankfully, he heard the car's horn at the last second and was able to get out the way. It took him a few weeks to adjust and to learn about this new world. He gained a lot of knowledge due to his love of reading books. He discovered that he loved learning and buried himself in a lot of books from this world, but he quickly learned that he couldn't sit on one spot for prolonged periods. He would find a lot of time passed by when he was reading. On the other hand, when he was not doing anything, time seemed to be at a standstill. Although he read a lot, he never forgot to keep up with his training. His chakra control massively increased and could tree climb and water walk like it was second nature. He also increased his sensory range by channeling chakra all throughout his body. When he joined Yancey Academy, he was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD, which explains why he could not stand still and why time was passing by slowly when he was not doing anything. The guidance counselors placed him in the 6th grade, which was where kids around his age were usually at. As for his room, he was placed in a room with a 12-year-old boy with black hair and sea green eyes. This is Percy Jackson. He quickly learned that Percy also had ADHD and that he has dyslexia. Percy lives in the same part of the city as Naruto. He found out that Percy had been kicked out of every private school that he had been enrolled in due to a series of unfortunate events that happened in every school he was in. His other roommate was a scrawny kid who must have been held back several grades. This is Grover Underwood. Grover is a disabled kid with a muscular disease in his legs causing him to be crippled all his life. He had a note to excuse him from PE for the rest of his life. Although, Naruto and Percy swears he could run so fast when it was enchilada day in the cafeteria. The three of them quickly became friends and were inseparable ever since. The two boys have been protective over Grover due to him being picked on by bullies. When someone tried to bully Grover, Percy always had to pick a fight with the bullies. Naruto, on the other hand, always seemingly keeps his cool whenever Grover gets bullied. Most of the time, Grover's prankers always found themselves on the wrong end of a prank whenever they tried to pick on him. On one occasion, there were two bullies who tried stealing his lunch money. The next day, these two boys woke up only to find themselves hanging from the flagpole by their underwear while the national anthem was playing. Everyone in the school could not figure out who the mysterious pranker was, but Percy and Grover had a sneaking suspicion that their roommate was the one responsible for the pranks because whenever they asked him if he heard of the pranks, he would have a gleam in his eyes. In their stay at Yancey Academy, Naruto, being an avid reader, aced his subjects, while Percy managed to get C's and D's despite his dyslexia due to Naruto's help. Naruto practically enjoyed every class he attended and managed to ignore his urges to get up and move about, but Percy just couldn't stand sitting in class and had a hard time reading. When Naruto wasn't studying, he would sneak out of his room to go out and train. He would just leave out a clone to stay in the room to avoid suspicion and help Percy study. He absolutely loved it when he was outside at night. He felt warm under the glow of the moon, like someone's arms were wrapping around him. He also feels like someone was watching over him as he trained. The days went by pretty much the same as always. Naruto continued to ace his classes due to his love of learning. His jutsu also managed to improve his control on the wind element and decided to start learning how to use fire chakra. Percy got into a lot of trouble because he kept on picking fights with the bullies who picked on Grover. This caused him to be on probation, which meant one more incident would cause him to get expelled. The days went on just like before until one day, Mr. Brunner announced they would be going on a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Mr. Brunner was this middle-aged man in a motorized wheelchair who always wore a frayed tweed jacket. He had thinning hair and a scruffy beard, and he always smelled like coffee. To most of the class, he didn't seem cool, but to Naruto and Percy, he was awesome and the best teacher in the school. He always told jokes and stories in class and even made them play games. Both Naruto and Percy could not wait for this event. At the same time, Percy had his fingers crossed that the trip would go well because of his previous bad track record of ruining school trips. Naruto, on the other hand, was determined to learn a lot on this trip and, of course, keep his friend out of any more trouble. On the way to the museum, the trip started out without a hitch, and Percy was determined to have normal trip without anything bad, embarrassing or even mildly entertaining happened on the trip. Well, at least that is what he thought. On the way to the museum, Nancy Bobofit, a freckly, red-headed and kleptomaniac girl, decided to pick on Grover. She kept throwing chunks of her peanut butter and ketchup sandwich at Grover. "I'm going to kill her," Percy mumbled. Grover tried to calm his friend down to prevent him from picking a fight with Nancy. "It's okay. I like peanut butter," he said while dodging another piece of Nancy's lunch. "That's it," Percy said as he started to get up, only to be pulled back to his seat by Grover. "You're already on probation," Grover reminded. "You know who'll get blamed if anything happens." "Yeah, besides some kind of miracle might happen," Naruto said with a familiar gleam in his eyes which his friends noticed. He turned around to glare at Nancy, only to have her blush at him. Despite what people think of Nancy, deep inside, she was still a girl and couldn't help but blush whenever Naruto looks her way. "Fine," Percy said with a sigh, but he couldn't help but think what the mysterious pranker had planned today. Metropolitan Museum of Art. When the group arrived at the museum, Grover and Mr. Brunner's face seemed to light up as they approached. It was Mr. Brunner who led the tour into the museum. Another teacher, Mrs. Dodds, followed the group and acted as chaperone. Mrs. Dodds was this little math teacher from Georgia who always wore a leather jacket, despite her age of 50. She came around the halfway point of the school year when the previous math teacher had a nervous breakdown. So, Mr. Brunner led the group through the big echoey hallways of the museum, past paintings of different people, marble statues of the gods and a glass case of really old pottery. The first stop on their tour was at a bronze chariot that was enlaced in ivory. Mr. Brunner went on to explain that the chariot was created by the Athena and Poseidon. Apparently, Athena created the chariot, while Poseidon supplied the horses. At the mention of Athena, Naruto had a tingling sensation, like he was supposed to know something. Naruto was broken out of his thoughts when Percy leaned on over and whispered something to his ear. "I bet it would be awesome to race them around Central Park." "Sounds fun and dangerous, hee hee hee," Naruto whispered back. Both boys gave each other a fist bump, while Grover sighed while looking at the boys with worry. "Gods, these two will be the death of me." "Keep up, honeys," Mrs. Dodds said sweetly to both boys, which broke them out of their conversation, only to see that they were lagging a bit behind. For the next hour, Mr. Brunner took the group throughout the whole museum. He explained the different armors of Greek and Roman origin and different strategies used in the different battles during the olden times. Naruto and Percy recognized some of the paintings that Mr. Brunner told them about in class. There was one of Hercules fighting the Nemean lion. There was another of Jason sailing across the Atlantic in his ship, the Argo. Yet another one was a painting depicting the large wooden horse that the Greeks used in Trojan War. At their last stop, Mr. Brunner gathered the class around a 13-foot-tall stone column with a sphinx on top. He explained that it was a grave marker, a steal, for a girl their age. He also told them about the carvings on the side. Naruto, Percy, and Grover tried to listen to Mr. Brunner, but everyone else around them was talking, so Naruto and Percy took turns telling people to shut up. Every time they told someone off though, Mrs. Dodds had an evil look on her face and was staring at the three boys. Mr. Brunner kept talking about Greek funeral art when Nancy Bobofit snickered something loudly, about a naked guy on the stele. Percy got fed up and told her off, "Will you shut up?" Only this time it was a little louder than he meant to, causing the whole group to laugh and Mr. Brunner to stop his story. "Mr. Jackson, do you have a question?" Mr. Brunner asked Percy, whose face was turning red from embarrassment. No sir," Percy managed to mumble out, causing more snickers to come out from Nancy's group. Naruto glared at the group, causing Nancy to get flustered and turn pink all over her face. Mr. Brunner pointed to one of the pictures on the stele. "Well then, perhaps you can tell me what this picture represents." Percy looked at the carving and was relieved that he knew what it was. "That's Cronus eating his kids, right?" "Yes," Mr. Brunner said, obviously not satisfied with the answer. "And he did this because..." "Well..." Percy racked his brain to remember. "Cronus was the king god and dash..." "God?" Mr. Brunner asked. "Titan," Percy corrected. "And he didn't trust his kids who were the gods. So, he ate them, right? But his wife hid baby Zeus, and gave Cronus a rock to eat instead. And later, when Zeus grew up, he tricked his dad Cronus into barfing up his brothers and sisters. Ew, said the girls listening behind them. Then there was a big fight, and the gods won. Percy continued, earning a nod of approval from Mr. Brunner. That's correct, he said. Then the world came to be ruled by the 12 Olympian gods, with the most powerful being the 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Ever since they started to rule, the gods came down to earth in order to hook up with mortals because they couldn't keep it in their pants. Naruto spoke up, earning a round of laughter from the group. That is correct, Mr. Uzumaki. Can you tell me the correct term for these children the gods have with mortals? He asked Naruto as he studied him with amused eyes. Demigods, he answered. Part mortal, part god. Can you name some of them, then? Mr. Brunner asked. Naruto tried to think. Well, there were Hercules and Perseus, who were sons of Zeus. He looked at his friend as he said the latter, knowing that he was named after him. Plus there was Theseus, who was a son of Poseidon. He continued. That's correct, very good Mr. Uzumaki. It's good to see you are listening in class. At the back of the group, Nancy mumbled to her friends, like we are going to use this in real life. Like it's going to say on our job applications, please explain why Cronus ate his kids. As if on cue, Mr. Brunner asked, and why, to paraphrase Ms. Bobofit's excellent question, does this matter in real life? Do you know Mr. Jackson? Busted, Grover muttered with a smirk on his face. Percy tried to think, but could not come up with an answer. I'm sorry, sir. I don't know. I see. Mr. Brunner looked disappointed, but his eyes lit up again when he saw Naruto raise his hand. Sir, I guess it's because we can learn from the past mistakes of the gods in order for us not to repeat them. Naruto said. Mr. Brunner smiled. Full credit for you, Mr. Uzumaki, half credit for you, Mr. Jackson. On that note, I believe it is lunch time. Mrs. Dodds, will you lead us outside? Naruto followed the group, but Percy was pulled aside by Mr. Brunner so he could talk to him. Naruto and Grover looked back to him, and Percy mouthed, I'll see you outside. The 2 boys nodded and headed for the exit with the group. On another part of the exhibit where there were statues of the Olympian gods, Naruto saw some of them in the corner of his eyes. Curiosity got the better of him, so he entered the room and marveled at the statues he was seeing in front of him. He looked around the room and saw a statue of a beautiful woman wearing a dress that stopped just above her knee and was holding a bow in one hand and an arrow on the other hand. He spotted a plaque in front of the statue, and he read it. Naruto couldn't help but feel familiarity as he was looking at the statue, like all those times he was training out in the open at night as he was bathed in the moonlight. The statue's gaze just felt like all those times. He was broken out of his thoughts when Mr. Brunner wheeled in next to him. Artemis, Mr. Brunner said. Goddess of the hunt, moon, childbirth, wild animals, and chastity. Hee, sorry for getting separated from the group, Mr. Brunner. I just got curious of the statues in here. I felt like I was drawn to them. Naruto said while scratching the back of his head. That's okay, my boy. It's good to see you are interested in history. Mr. Brunner replied with a small smile on his face. Come on now. You must be hungry. As the 2 were about to leave, Naruto had one last look at the exhibit and saw 2 more notable figures. A woman dressed in battle armor, and a man with winged sandals and a helmet carrying a staff with 2 snakes wrapped around it. For the second time today, he felt like he was supposed to know something, but his mind couldn't wrap around it, so he just shrugged it off and headed out. During lunch, the class gathered at the steps of the museum as they watched traffic zip by across Fifth Avenue. Overhead, storm clouds were brewing, which the 3 just figured it was global warming or something. Despite the terrible weather, their other classmates do not seem to notice it. The trio sat on the edge of a fountain eating their lunch when Grover asked detention. Nah, Percy said. Not from Brunner. I just wish he would lay off me sometimes. I mean, I'm not a genius unlike our friend here. Percy said, looking at Naruto, who was slurping on his 5th cup of instant ramen he brought just for the trip. Naruto just let out a burp, and Grover just shrugged and said, Can I have your apple? To which Naruto chuckled. The three looked over to their classmates who were pelting poor pigeons with crackers. One frizzy, red-headed girl was pickpocketing a pedestrian. A few minutes later, Nancy and her friends came over to the trio and decided to dump her lunch on Grover. "Oops," she said with a grin, trying to avoid the glare that Naruto was giving her. Percy was so angry that he stood up like he was to pick another fight, but he heard a wave roar in his ears. Then, all of a sudden, Nancy was in the fountain making a loud inaudible splash, catching the attention of everyone, especially one Mrs. Dodds. The whole class whispered amongst themselves. "Did you see the water? Like it was grabbing her." Mrs. Dodds materialized next to them, with triumphant look in her eyes. Naruto couldn't believe how fast she got there. He didn't even see her walk towards them. "Mr. Jackson, come with me," Mrs. Dodds said. "No, it was me. I pushed her," Grover quickly said. "I don't think so, Mr. Underwood," Mrs. Dodds replied as he glared at Grover, which scared the boy to death. But Grover tried to say something else, but he was cut off by Mrs. Dodds. "You will stay here." "It's okay, Grover. Thanks for trying," Percy comforted. As the two were leaving, Grover was looking at Percy and Mr. Brunner back and forth, hoping that the latter would notice. Grover yelped when Naruto patted his shoulder and asked, "What's the matter, Grover? Why were you trying to cover for Percy? And why the pale look on your face?" Grover couldn't answer, causing Naruto to just stand up. "Wait, where are you going?" Grover asked when he saw Naruto stand up. "Bathroom," Naruto quickly replied. "Inside the museum." Naruto went out of the bathroom only to hear screaming coming from a part of the museum. "That sounds like Percy," he said to himself. "I'd recognize that scream anywhere." Naruto bounded toward the sound of Percy's scream only to run into him trying to run away from something. "Geez, Percy, what's..." Naruto was cut off when he saw what Percy was running from. "Where is it?" a strange bat-like creature with long talons and leathery wings asked with a scratchy voice. "I won't ask again." "Percy, what the hell is that thing talking about?" Naruto said while he was standing up. He held a stance with one arm behind his back and the other arm in front of him in a come gesture. I don't," Percy stuttered. The creature lunged, obviously targeting Percy. Percy braced himself for the worst when he heard his friend behind him shout. "Wind style, great breakthrough," Naruto shouted as he breathed out wind from his mouth, causing the creature to be sent back flying the opposite direction. "Naruto, what was..." Percy was cut off when he heard a shriek coming from the other direction. They saw the creature standing up again when they heard the familiar wheelchair of Mr. Brunner wheeling in towards their direction. "What ho, Percy, Naruto." Mr. Brunner threw two objects which elongated and became weapons. Naruto snatched two kunai out of the air. These pair of weapons oddly has 3 blades instead on one and was in a perfect mix of black, silver and bronze. Percy, on the other hand, caught a medium-length, double-bladed sword which he immediately recognized. They didn't have time to marvel at their newly acquired weapon when the creature shouted, "You will pay for that." Mrs. Dodds lunged again shouting, "Die honeys." Naruto, who was quick on his feet, charged the creature. It did not have time to react when Naruto jumped in front of him and sliced at the creature's side and delivered a drop kick right at its head. "Percy!" Naruto shouted to his friend. Percy, who was stunned by all he was seeing, jumped into action as he saw the creature falling to the ground, making small cracks at the site of impact. Percy charged the creature and slashed across its chest as it struggled to stand up again. The creature vaporized on the spot and exploded to yellow powder, leaving the stench of sulfur in the air. The two boys looked in shock at the aftermath of what transpired. Naruto walked up to Percy and asked, "What was that thing?" That was Mrs. Dodds." Percy managed to stutter out to the shock of Naruto. "What was that just now, the thing you shouted?" Percy asked. "Believe me, you wouldn't even believe me if I told you," Naruto replied. So Naruto explained to Percy where he came from, only adding to the shock of Percy. Naruto made Percy promise to keep everything that transpired to himself. Both boys were shocked again to find that Mr. Brunner was not there again, so they just shrugged and blamed everything on their imagination and decided to leave. Back at the entrance of the museum, Grover was still sitting in the same spot where they were. Clearly, something was scaring him. Beside him, Nancy Bobofit was still standing there grumbling something to her friends. "I hope Mrs. Kerr whipped your butt," she said when he saw the two boys approach. Both boys were puzzled with the mention of the new name, so Percy asked, "Who?" "Our teacher." "Duh," Nancy replied, clearly annoyed. Percy just had a puzzled look on his face. Nancy got even more annoyed, so she just rolled her eyes and walked away with her friend. She took one last look back at the blonde who was glaring at her, and she ran away with a blush clearly visible on her cheeks, causing her friends to run after her. They asked Grover where Mrs. Dodds was and who was Mrs. Kerr. At first Grover stared at them and laughed nervously like the two boys were saying some sort of joke. Then, he said, "Who?" without looking them in the eye. "Not funny, man," Naruto said. "This is serious." They saw Mr. Brunner on his wheelchair like he had never moved out of his spot. They decided to approach him. As the two boys approached, Mr. Brunner looked up a little distracted. "Ah, those would be my pens. Please bring your own writing utensils in the future, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Uzumaki." It was Naruto who decided to ask, "Sir, where is Mrs. Dodds?" He stared blankly at the two boys and replied, "Who?" "The other chaperone, Mrs. Dodds." "The pre-algebra teacher," Percy said. He frowned and said, "Percy, Naruto, there is no Mrs. Dodds on this trip. As far as I know, there has never been a Mrs. Dodds in Yancey Academy. Are you boys feeling all right?" Both boys just nodded, even more bewildered than before. That just left both boys with more questions than answers. Chapter 3, The Socks of Death. Naruto had experience doing pranks. He was practically an expert when it comes to these things, but he couldn't wrap his mind around this incident. It had been weeks since that little incident happened in the museum. Naruto and Percy had been going from student to ask if they knew anything about Mrs. Dodds, but every student they asked just looked at them as if they had gone insane. It's just like the whole school was in on a little secret, and they were keeping Naruto and Percy in the dark. However, there was one person who could not convince them that they were just imagining things. Every so often, they would spring a Mrs. Dodds reference in their classmates, just to see if they could trip them up, but to no avail. Well, except for one Grover Underwood. Grover couldn't keep up the ruse. He would hesitate when asked, and then he would claim she never existed. This made them think something had happened in the museum. The weather worsened as days went by, as did Percy's mood. One night, a thunderstorm blew open the windows in their dorm room. A few days later, the biggest tornado ever was spotted in the Hudson Valley, touched down only 50 miles from the school. One of the current events they studied in social studies was the unusual amount of planes that went down in the Atlantic this year. Grover and Naruto started to feel worried about their friend. Percy started feeling cranky and irritable. He got into more fights with Nancy and her friends, especially when Naruto was not around. Also, even with the blonde's help, Percy's grades slipped from C's and D's to F's. Finally, when Mr. Nicole asked Percy for the millionth time why he was too lazy to study for spelling tests, Percy snapped. He called him an old sot. Naruto was really pissed that the teacher didn't know how to handle the children with special needs, but he decided to keep it to himself. The headmaster sent a letter to his mom the following week. Percy was not invited back to Yancey Academy for the next year, but Percy didn't mind. Naruto figured he was feeling homesick and wanted to see his mom again. Days passed more and more and exam week got closer. Naruto, as usual, was burying himself in books, studying for every subject he had in school. Percy, on the other hand, only studied Latin, since Mr. Brunner is his favorite teacher, of course with help from his blonde friend. On the night before the exam, Naruto was just lying on his bed resting his head from the tough week of getting ready for their exams. Percy was still trying to study. According to Percy, the words kept swimming across the page and circling around his head. He got so frustrated that he threw his book across the room. He paced the room as Naruto watched him walk back and forth. "Need help?" Naruto offered. "I would love to, but I hate to mess up your concentration, and I know your head hurts from all that studying." Naruto smiled that his friend was still thinking of him even though he needed help himself. Naruto thought for a while and said, "How about we go ask Mr. Brunner for help? I'll even go with you. Will he be willing to help?" "Of course. He is a teacher after all. Besides, I need a walk to stretch my muscles a bit." And so Naruto and Percy made their way to Mr. Brunner's office. In the hallways of Yancey Academy. Naruto and Percy walked through the hallways of the school on the way to Mr. Brunner's office. They saw most of them were dark and empty. Well, except for one. Mr. Brunner's door was ajar and light from the room was seeping through the window. When they were both about 3 steps from the door, they heard a voice who was definitely Grover say, "Worried about Percy and Naruto, sir?" Both of them were surprised at the mention of their names. What's more, they were wondering why Grover was worried about them. Usually, it would be them who would be worried about Grover because of the constant bullying. Curiosity got the better of them, so they leaned in closer to listen in. "Alone this summer," Grover was saying. "I mean a kindly one in the school. Now, that we know for sure, and they know too. We would only make things worse by rushing them," Mr. Brunner said. "We need Percy to mature more, and besides, I'm not really sure about Naruto. He is very mysterious, I'm not sure of what to make of him." Naruto's eyes widened. "Do they know who I am? How did they figure it out?" he said internally. "But they may not have time, especially Percy. The summer solstice deadline will have to be resolved without them, Grover. Let Percy enjoy his ignorance while he still can, and keep Naruto in the dark along with him." "Sir, they saw her." "Their imagination," Mr. Brunner insisted. "The mist over the students and the staff will be enough to convince them of that." The mist. Naruto thought. He looked at Percy who had the same dumbfounded look on his face. "But they have been asking question after question. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." "You have to, Grover. I know they have become your friends during your time here, but this will keep them safe." "Sir, I can't fail in my duties again." Grover's voice cracked with emotion. "You know what that would mean." "You haven't failed, Grover," Mr. Brunner said kindly. "I should have seen her for what she was. Now let's just worry about keeping them alive until next fall." Thud. Percy dropped his mythology book, which caused Mr. Brunner to fall silent. "Shit," Naruto said as he grabbed Percy and the mythology book with one swift motion and silently disappeared into one janitor's closets close by. Clop clop clop. Naruto and Percy could hear what he thought were hoof sounds on the floor, then a sound like an animal shuffling right outside the door. They could see a large dark shape paused in front of the door and stopped. Naruto sat there with a hand over Percy's mouth to prevent him from making a sound. Somewhere in the hallway, Mr. Brunner spoke. "Nothing," he murmured. "My nerves haven't been right since winter solstice." "Mine neither," Grover said. "But I could have sworn." "Go back to the dorm," Mr. Brunner told Grover. "You've got a long day of exams tomorrow." Grover sighed. "Don't remind me." The lights went out in Mr. Brunner's office. Naruto and Percy waited until they were sure no one was outside, which seemed like forever. They went back to the dorm where to find Grover lying on the bed like he has been there all night. "Sup G-Man?" Naruto and Percy said at the same time. "Hey guys." Grover greeted back, but he frowned when he saw the look on Percy's face. "Geez Perce, you look awful. Is everything alright?" "Just tired," Percy managed to say. Percy immediately turned away so Grover couldn't read his expression. Naruto studied Percy. He knew that what they heard a while back was getting to him. It bugged him too. He couldn't understand what kind of danger they were talking about. The next day, Naruto, after finishing the Latin, had a big smile on his face, obviously confident that he did well. Percy, on the other hand, looked like he suffered through the exam he was taking. The letters, as usual, were swimming off the page, and he was reeling from all the Greek and Roman names he had misspelled. Naruto saw Percy walk out of the door only to hear Mr. Brunner call him back inside to talk to him. Before Percy walked back in, they looked at each other worried that they may have found out about the eavesdropping they did yesterday. Naruto channeled chakra to his ears so he could listen in. "Percy," he said. "Don't be discouraged about leaving Yancey Academy. It's for the best." He heard that Mr. Bruner's tone was kind, but he could just imagine what Percy might feel like hearing those words from his favorite teacher. "Percy's not going to like that," he said to himself. "Okay, sir." Percy managed to mumble out a reply. "I mean..." Mr. Brunner struggled to find the words to say. "This isn't the right place for you. It was only a matter of time." "Right," he said back with a trembling voice. No, Mr. Brunner said. "Oh, confound it all. What I'm trying to say, you're not normal, Percy. That is nothing to be." "Thanks," Percy blurted out. "Thanks for reminding me." Naruto heard Percy begin to walk out. He saw the door open and saw Percy with a long face. He patted his friend on the back before walking back in to talk to Mr. Brunner and say his goodbyes to their favorite teacher. He saw Mr. Brunner contemplating on the things he said to Percy. "That could have gone better, Mr. Brunner. Percy looks like he had an earful from you," Naruto said as he approached their teacher. Yes," Mr. Brunner nodded as he saw Naruto. "Perhaps I may have been too hard on him. You just wanted the best for him. He will understand eventually," Naruto replied, earning a look of appreciation from Mr. Brunner. "Yes, well, how about you, Mr. Uzumaki? Will you be returning here next year?" "I don't think so, Mr. Brunner. Since Percy isn't coming back again, I might go to where he would transfer and keep him company, maybe keep him out of trouble too." Mr. Brunner nodded. "You're a good friend, Naruto. Percy and Grover are lucky to have you looking out for them." Naruto smiled. "Thanks, Mr. Brunner, for everything. I guess I'll see you around." They shook hands and said their goodbyes before Naruto headed out. Last day of the term. Naruto and Percy packed their bags, getting ready to go home. Percy contacted his mom in order to let her know that Naruto might be spending the summer with them since he lived alone. They headed out once they made sure they didn't leave anything. As they made their way out, they could see everyone staring at them, more particularly at Naruto. It looks like he made quite the impression on his schoolmates. The girls watched them go out sadly, knowing that the blonde was not coming back to the school next year. Both boys couldn't care less about anyone else about the others, but they dreaded saying goodbye to their best friend, Grover. It turned out, though, that he booked a ticket on the same Greyhound as the two, so they were together again, heading for the city. During the whole bus ride, Grover was fidgety, and glancing nervously down the aisle, watching the other passengers as if worrying about bullies as usual. Finally, Percy leaned over to Grover and whispered, "Looking for kindly ones." Naruto saw what Percy did, so he leaned over to listen in. Grover nearly jumped out of his seat. What do you mean?" "We kinda listened in on your conversation with Mr. Brunner," Naruto confided, while Percy nodded. "Oh, not much," Naruto said. "What's the summer solstice deadline?" Percy asked out of curiosity. He winced. "Look, Percy, Naruto, I was worried about you too, see? I mean, hallucinating about demon math teachers." "Grover," Percy tried to cut him off. "And I was just telling Mr. Brunner that maybe you were overstressed or something, because there was no such person as Mrs. Dodds, and..." "Grover, man, you're a really bad liar," Naruto said, pointing to Grover's ears. "Whenever you lie, you get all flustered and your ears turn pink." From his shirt pocket, he fished out grubby business cards and gave one to each of his friends. "Just take these, okay? In case you need me this summer." The card was in fancy script which was murder to Percy's eyes, but Naruto was able to read it. The card said, "Grover Underwood, Keeper, Half-Blood Hill, Long Island, New York, 800-009-0009. Fancy hee, Naruto said. "What's half?" "SHHH, don't say it out loud," he yelped. "That's my summer address." Percy was upset from hearing that, while Naruto was just surprised. They never considered Grover to be rich like the other snobby kids back at Yancey. "Okay," Percy said glumly. "So, like, if I wanted to visit your mansion?" Grover nodded, "Or, or if you need me. Why would I need you? Percy asked. Naruto was just silent about the whole thing, not sure about how he should make of this, until he heard Percy say that. Geez Percy, go easy on the guy. Grover blushed right down to his Adam's apple. Look Percy, Naruto, I kinda have to protect you. They just stared at him until they heard a grinding noise under their feet. Black smoke poured out of the dashboard, and the stench of rotting eggs permeated through the whole bus. The driver cursed and limped the Greyhound to the side of the highway. The passengers groaned in disappointment at what happened. The driver went out to the engine compartment and started clanking at the engine to try and get it to work. After a few minutes of no success in tinkering with the engine, the driver announced that everyone should get off the bus. They were stopped at a stretch of country road, no place you'd notice if you didn't break down there. On their side of the highway, there was nothing but maple trees and litter from passing cars. On the other side, across 4 lanes of asphalt shimmering with afternoon heat, was an old-fashioned fruit stand. On the stand were heaping boxes of blood-red cherries and apples, walnuts, and apricots, jugs of cider in a clawfoot tub full of ice. There were no customers, just 3 old ladies sitting under the shade of the maple trees, knitting the biggest pair of socks anyone has ever seen. The socks were the size of sweaters, but you would never mistake them to be sweaters. Clearly, they were socks. The lady on the right knitted one of them. The lady on the left knitted the other. The lady in the middle held an enormous basket filled with electric blue yarn. All 3 women looked ancient, with pale faces wrinkled like fruit leather, silver hair tied in white bandanas, bony arms sticking out of bleach cotton dresses. That weirdest thing was they were looking straight at Percy. The blood on Grover's face drained and his nose was twitching. Grover, Naruto tried to call Grover's attention. Percy, tell me they're not looking at you. They are, aren't they? Yeah, weird huh? You think those socks would fit me? Naruto just chuckled. Not funny Percy. Not funny at all. The old lady in the middle took out a huge pair of gold and silver, long-blade scissors, like shears. Both boys heard Grover gasp as if catching his breath. Grover pulled both boys by their arms. Come on, we're getting on the bus. Hey, watch it. Both boys said at the same time. As they were about to go, the middle one cut the yarn which the trio heard across the 4 lanes of traffic. The other 2 balled up the electric blue socks, leaving Percy and Naruto wondering for who it might be. At the rear end of the bus, the driver wrenched a big chunk of smoking metal out of the engine compartment. Surprisingly, the bus shuddered and the engine roared it back to life. The passengers cheered. Darn right, the driver yelled. He slapped the bus with his hat. Everybody back on board. Naruto noticed that Percy was feverish as if he got the flu and Grover was shivering and his teeth were chattering. Grover? Naruto asked. Yeah. What are you not telling us? Grover dabbed his forehead with his shirt sleeve. What did you guys see at the fruit stand? You mean the old ladies? Percy asked. What about them? They're not like Mrs. Dodds, are they? Grover's expression was hard to read, but Naruto and Percy had a feeling that it was something. He said, Jay, just tell me what you saw. The middle one took out her scissors, and she cut the yarn. Percy said. Grover closed his eyes and made a gesture with his fingers. Naruto thought that he might have been crossing himself, but it wasn't. It was something much older. You saw her snip the cord? Grover said, starting to panic. Yeah, so? Percy asked, but there was no answer from his friend. This is not happening. Grover mumbled. He started chewing at his thumb. I don't want this to be like the last time. What last time? Naruto asked, still Grover didn't answer. Always the 6th grade. They never get past the 6th grade. Let me walk you home from the bus station. Promise me. Grover said to both boys. Both boys nodded at his odd request. Is this like a superstition or something? Percy asked. Still no answer. Grover, does the snipping of the yarn mean someone is going to die? Grover looked at both boys mournfully, like he was already picking which flowers would work best at their funeral. The rest of the trip was silent. Nobody dared to say anything else. Naruto studied his 2 friends. Percy was visibly shaken by what happened, and Grover kept mumbling to himself about some kind of failure he had in the past. Naruto just thought. Grover, what are you hiding? Chapter 4, Grover has hooves? Brush up on Greek mythology. This rang throughout Naruto's mind all throughout the bus ride. His adoptive mother told him to do this when he got to this world. At first, he thought nothing of it, thinking that his mother just wanted to share one of her hobbies to him, but now, he wasn't so sure about it. He sat on the bus thinking about the things that happened so far. He remembered the attack of Mrs. Dodds, the bat-like creature, to which he remembered, was a fury. He also remembered that every time he took a whiff of Grover, he smelled like goat, making him remember reading about a breed. Then, just recently, there were the 3 old ladies who were weaving a huge sock with electric blue yarn to the list of weird. He tried to think about where in Greek mythology he read about them. It's them, isn't it? He believed it. Could it be? It couldn't be a coincidence. Naruto, we're here. Percy called Naruto's attention. With all the thinking Naruto was doing this whole trip, he didn't even notice they have arrived at their destination. He noticed Grover was still mumbling, "Why does this always happen? And, why does it always have to be the 6th grade?" to himself as they made their way out of the bus. When they got off the bus, Grover said, "Guys, promise me that you will wait for me here." With hands of his pants jumping. "Promise," Percy said, but Naruto was just silent, still thinking about all the things that happened. He made a beeline to the nearest restroom without waiting for Naruto's response. Instead of waiting, Percy pulled Naruto outside. "Wait. Percy, didn't you promise Grover that he could walk you home? We shouldn't do this to him." Naruto protested. "Look Naruto, I know this is rude to him, but I want to see my mom now. So, just choose, either come with me or wait for Grover." Naruto was torn between the two of them. He keeps Kakashi's teaching, those who break the rules are scum, but those who abandon their friends are even worse than scum, to heart, but he didn't want to leave either of them. Damn it! Naruto thought. Just a second, then. He ran to an empty alleyway and made the hand signs. Shadow Clone Jutsu. Keep an eye on Grover, I don't want him to get hurt or anything. Dispel when you think the time is right and do not let anyone, including Grover, see you. The clone nodded. He made a half-ram hand sign, and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. The real Naruto ran back to Percy. "What did you do?" Percy asked. "I made a clone to keep an eye on and follow Grover," Naruto answered. Percy just left it at that, since he wanted to go home as soon as possible. Percy and Naruto caught the first taxi they could get to Naruto and Percy's apartment. Percy and Sally's apartment. Percy opened the door to a revolting sight. He saw Gabe playing poker with his friends. The television blared ESPN, but nobody was watching. Chips and beer cans were strewn over the carpet. Gabe Ugliano is Percy's stepfather. Right now, he looked like a tuskless walrus in thrift store clothes, and he reeked of moldy pizza wrapped in gym shorts. He had 3 strands of hair on his head all combed over his bald scalp like it made him famous or something. He managed an electronics megamart in Queens, but stayed home most of the time. Despite that, he kept on collecting paychecks and spent them on beer and cigars. Naruto and Percy walked in the house. Gabe seemed to notice them. Hardly looking up, he said, "So, you're home, and I see that blonde punk is here again. Where's my mom?" Percy asked. "Working," he said. "You got any cash?" Naruto glared at Gabe. He knew the drill. Gabe expected Percy to provide his gambling money, calling it their guy secret. "I don't have any cash," Percy told him. Gabe raised a greasy eyebrow. He didn't believe him. He, like a bloodhound, could sniff money from a mile away, which was surprising since his own smell should have covered up everything else. "You took a taxi from the bus station," he said. "Probably paid with a 20. Got $6 or $7 in change. Somebody expect to live under this roof, he ought to carry his own weight. Am I right, Eddie?" Eddie, the super of the apartment building, looked at Percy with sympathy. "Come on, Gabe. The kid just got here. Come on, Gabe, the kid just got here. Am I right?" Gabe repeated firmly this time. Before Percy was about move when Naruto, who during his days in Yancey Academy done a lot of training with Genjutsu, put a hand on Percy's shoulder and whispered on his ear, "Wait, don't. I'm going to play some mind games on him." He cast an illusion on Gabe and his friends. Naruto made all of them on the poker table see Percy dig out a wad of cash from his pocket and threw the money on the table and say, "I hope you lose." Percy and Naruto turned around to go to the former's room. On their way to the room, they heard Gabe say, "Your report card came in, brain boy." They didn't hear what Gabe said because they slammed the door to Percy's room. Well, it wasn't really Percy's room. During school days, it was Gabe's study, but he didn't study anything except old car magazines. He just loved to shove Percy's stuff in closets, leaving muddy boots on the windowsill, and do his best to make the room smell like his nasty cologne, stale beer, and cigars. Percy dropped his suitcase on the bed while Naruto left his by the wall. Both of them had things on their mind. Percy had the look of fear on his face as he remembered Grover's look of panic when he made the both of them promise that he would walk the two boys to the house. Naruto, on the other hand, couldn't shake the thoughts he had off his mind. It was bothering him. Then, both boys heard a female voice call out to them. "Percy? Naruto?" She opened the door to see both boys sitting on the bed. "This is Sally Jackson, Percy's mother and, according to him, the best person in the world. Her own parents died when she was 5, and she was adopted by her uncle who didn't care much for her." Naruto's respect for her grew when he learned that she was still pursuing her dream to be a novelist, which at the moment she was nowhere near achieving. It made him remember his old dream of becoming Hokage. All her life, it seemed that misfortune followed her, but she got a break when he met Percy's dad. She didn't like talking about him that much because it makes her sad, and Percy didn't have a lot of memories of him, only the faintest glow of a smile. They weren't married and their relationship was a secret. Then, one day, he left for an important journey and never came back. Sally termed it as lost at sea. She raised Percy all by herself, which wasn't easy, but she never complained, not even once. She worked odd jobs and took night classes to get a high school diploma. What puzzled Naruto was why Sally married Gabe and continued to stay with him despite the way he treats her. When she first met Naruto, her heart just melted when she learned that he was just like her. She learned that Naruto was living by himself. She was relieved when she learned that Naruto was supported by his adoptive mother. She also offered Naruto to be his guardian, to which he gladly accepted, and ever since, Naruto has been coming over, much to Gabe's annoyance. So, Sally entered the room, and immediately hugged both of them. "Oh Percy, I can't believe it. You've grown since Christmas," she said. "And Naruto, I hope you loved the candies I sent you." Today, she was wearing her Sweets on America uniform, which smelled like chocolate, licorice, and other candies she brought from their store at the Grand Central Station. Just like always, she brought home a huge bag of free samples. They sat on the edge of the bed while Percy attacked the blueberry sour strings and Naruto ate the orange gummies. She ran her fingers through the boy's hair and demanded to know everything the two didn't put in the letters. She didn't mention anything about Percy's expulsion, like she didn't care about it. She cared more about her two boys' well-being. Percy complained that she was smothering both of them, but secretly, he was really, really glad to see her. Sally saw a tear drop from Naruto's eyes. "Naruto, are you okay?" she asked. "Why yeah, it's just this stuff is new to me." Sally smiled and wiped Naruto's tear with her finger. From the other room, Gabe shouted, "Hey Sally! How about some bean dip, huh?" Percy and Naruto frowned. For her sake, Percy and Naruto tried to sound upbeat as they told her everything that happened. Percy started to choke up and Naruto felt sad when they remembered Grover and Mr. Brunner. When they made it to the museum trip, Percy looked at each with fear in their eyes. "What? Did something scare you?" She tried to tug at their conscience, trying to extract the secrets from them. "No mom/no Aunt Sally." The two boys felt bad for lying, but she just pursed her lips. She didn't push them. "I have a surprise for you," she said. "We're going to the beach." "Montauk?" Percy asked, his eyes sparkling. 3 nights, same cabin. "When?" "Right after I get changed." Naruto, you are always welcome to come. Oh, Naruto stammered. Is it okay? I might be in the way. No Naruto, not at all. She said, moving her hands through Naruto's whisker marks, which tickled him. All right then. Naruto decided. Gabe appeared at the door and growled, Bean dip, Sally? Didn't you hear me? Percy looked like he wanted to punch Gabe, and Naruto had his fists clenched while trying to control his temper. Sally's looked at both boys. The look on her face was saying be nice to Gabe for a little while. Just until we leave for Montauk. I was on my way, honey. She told Gabe. We were just talking about the trip. Gabe's eyes got small. The trip? You were serious about that? I knew it. Percy muttered. He won't let us go. Of course he will. Sally said. Your stepfather was just worried about money. That's all. Besides, she added, Gabriel won't have to settle for bean dip. I'll make him enough 7-layer dip for the whole weekend. Guacamole, sour cream. The works. Gabe softened a bit. So this money for the trip, it comes out of your clothes budget, right? Yes honey, Sally said. And you won't take my car anywhere but there and back. We'll be very careful. Gabe scratched his double chin. Maybe if you hurry with that 7-layered dip, and maybe if the kid apologizes for interrupting my poker game. Percy and Naruto tried their hardest not to snicker since they remembered the illusion Naruto cast. The former just managed to mumble out, I'm sorry I interrupted your incredibly important poker game. Please go back to it right now. Gabe's eyes narrowed. His tiny brain was probably trying to detect the sarcasm Percy used. Yeah, whatever, he decided. He took a look at Naruto and asked, Is Blondie coming too? Yes, of course honey. Sally answered. Gabe just nodded, probably just glad that the blonde wasn't staying in their house. He shuddered when he remembered the blonde wiping him clean of money when he let him join the poker game. Thank you, Percy, my mom said. Once we get to Montauk, we'll talk more about whatever you've forgotten to tell me, okay? For a moment, there was fear in her eyes, the same fear they saw Grover had at the bus, but her smile returned. She ruffled both boys' hair and went to make Gabe's 7-layer dip. After an hour, they were ready to leave. Gabe took a break from his poker game to watch the boys lug the bags to the car. He kept groaning about losing Sally's cooking and, more importantly, his 1978 Camaro for the whole weekend. Not a scratch Blondie, he warned as the last bag was loaded, not one little scratch. He normally saves that for me. Percy said. Both shrugged at that. Gabe made his way up to the apartment. Naruto made a half-ram seal and released the illusion. After that, both of them climbed in the Camaro. Naruto made a request to stop by his apartment to get some stuff before they went on their way. As the car drove off, one could hear a Gabe Ugliano shout out in rage. Where's my money? Montauk Beach. When they arrived at the rental cabin at sunset, Sally and Percy's faces seemed to light up. It was located at the South Shore, way out at the tip of Long Island. It was a little pastel box with faded curtains, half sunken in the dunes. There was always sand in the sheets and spiders in the cabinets, and most of the time, the sea was too cold to swim in. Despite the simple style, they both loved it. Percy and Sally started the usual cleaning routine to which they showed Naruto. They walked on the beach, fed blue and orange corn chips to the seagulls, and munched on a variety of blue and orange candies Sally had brought from work. Why blue and orange food, you ask? Well, for the blue food, Gabe and Sally had a fight about blue food not existing. Ever since then, Sally went out of her way to cook and bake blue food, from cakes to corn chips to smoothies. When Naruto came along, he got curious about all the blue food that Sally makes, and Percy explained to him why. Naruto requested Sally if she could make some orange food, to which Sally happily agreed. When it got dark, they made a fire. Sally was impressed that Naruto could make a fire so easily. Naruto just said he went camping a lot as a kid. Sally told them stories about the books she wanted to write someday, when she had enough money to quit the shop. Eventually, Percy asked Sally what was always on his mind whenever they went to Montauk, his father. Sally's eyes went misty. He was kind, she said, tall, handsome, and powerful, but gentle too. You his black hair, you know, and his green eyes. Sally fished out a blue jelly bean out of her candy bag. I wish he could see you, Percy. He would be so proud. How old was I? Percy asked, when he left. He was only with me for one summer, Percy, right at this beach, this cabin. Sally watched the flames as she explained. But, he knew me as a baby. No, honey. He knew I was expecting a baby, but he never saw you. He had to leave when you were born. There was a moment of silence. Sally cleared her throat. What about you, Naruto? What were your parents like? On the first week he was this world, he wondered what his parents were like. One day, he received another note describing his parents. Today, he was giving the short version of what he read. Well, they say I look like my dad. He never knew who his mother was, so he was raised by his father. He grew up a genius. He was what you call a prodigy. He became a soldier and eventually a war hero. Through this he managed to become a pretty big deal in our village. As for my mother, they say I got her personality. She had a round face and red hair, which always got her teased. She never knew who his father was, so she was raised by her mother. She was mischievous growing up, always pranking people. She was a target for bullies, but she never backed down from them. Do you have any pictures of them? Percy asked. Naruto just shook his head. There was a moment of silence again. Percy broke the silence when he asked, Are you going to send me away again to another boarding school? She pulled a marshmallow from the fire. I don't know, honey. Her voice was heavy. I think we'll have to do something. Because you don't want me around. Naruto just face-palmed internally at the density of his friend. He didn't know why his friend couldn't see that it was hard enough for his mom as it is. There were tears in Sally's eyes as she took Percy's hand. Oh Percy, no. I have to, honey, for your own good. Because I'm not normal, Percy said. You say as if it's a bad thing, Percy, but you don't realize how important you are. I thought Yancey Academy was far away enough. I thought you'd finally be safe. Safe from what? Percy remembered all the weird and scary things that happened when he was a child. Some of which he tried to forget. Naruto remembered the conversation Mr. Brunner and Grover had. I've tried to keep you as close to me as I could, Sally said. They told me that was a mistake. But there's only one other option, Percy, the place your father wanted to send you. And I just can't stand to do it. They? Who are they? He asked himself, not wanting to interrupt their conversation. My father wanted me to go to a special school. Not a school, she said softly. A summer camp. I'm sorry, Percy, she said, seeing the look in my eyes. But I can't talk about it. I couldn't send you to that place. It might mean saying goodbye to you for good. For good? But if it's only a summer camp. She turned toward the fire, and Naruto knew from her expression that if Percy had asked her any more questions she would start to cry. Naruto didn't know what to say in this situation. He felt like intruding in a private conversation, so he just enjoyed the moonlit night, which reminded him of those missions that he had with Team 7. Percy decided not to ask any more questions, seeing that his mother was about to cry. The three, then, called it a night. That night it was storming hard, and the three woke up with a start. The storm had woken up Sally when a thunder boomed overhead. Percy was awoken by his weird dream he was having about two animals, a white horse and a golden eagle, were fighting, and a monstrous voice fighting in the background. Naruto's eyes shot open up when the memories of the clone that followed Grover flooded his mind. What was notable was the latter parts of the memories, particularly the area it had seen. It was the area they drove through on the way here. Naruto jumped out of bed and opened the door to see Grover was about to knock. Grover was panting. Searching all night. What were you thinking? Naruto stuttered while scratching the back of his head. Percy made me do it. Sally looked in terror, not at Grover, but at the reason of why he'd come. Percy, she said, shouting to be heard over the rain. What happened at school? What didn't you tell me? Percy was frozen, looking at Grover. Os yakai alloy theoi. He yelled. It's right behind me. Didn't you tell her? Naruto and Percy were shocked to register that Grover cursed in ancient Greek, and they understood it perfectly. They were too shocked to wonder what trouble Grover had gotten himself into now. My mom looked at both boys sternly and talked in a tone she'd never used before. Percy, Naruto. Tell me now. Naruto and Percy stammered while they took turns explaining about the three old ladies with electric blue yarn and Mrs. Dodds. Her face turned deathly pale in the flashes of lightning. Sally grabbed her purse, tossed Naruto and Percy their rain jacket, and said, all of you. Get in the car. Now. All three ran to the car, but Grover wasn't exactly running, he was trotting, shaking his shaggy hindquarters. It hit Naruto like a bullet, the goat scent of Grover, the way he could run but still limp when he walked because, on the lower half of Grover's body, were cloven hooves. It can't be. He said to himself. Chapter 5, Going Hamburger. The Camaro drove through dark country roads bounding towards a place unknown to Naruto and Percy. Wind slammed against the Camaro, and rain lashed through the windshield. Sally kept her foot on the gas the whole time, though Naruto was wondering if Sally could see where they were going. Percy stared at Grover with a dumbfounded look on his face. Naruto spoke up, no, Percy. You aren't going insane. I can see it too, though I still can't believe it. Like he could read Percy's mind. All Percy could say was, so, you and my mom know each other. Grover kept glancing at the rear-view mirror though there were no cars behind them. Not exactly, he said. I mean, we've never met in person, but she knew I was watching you. He continued while pointing at the two boys. Watching us? Naruto asked. Keeping tabs on you. Making sure you were okay. But I wasn't faking being your friend, he added hastily. I am your friend. What are you exactly? That, Grover was about to answer when Naruto cut him off. He's a satyr. Both boys looked at the blonde. How did you, Grover asked. My mom told me to read up on Greek mythology. I thought nothing of it, at first, but now, it's all starting to make sense. But those are just myths. Percy said. Were those old ladies at the fruit stand a myth, Percy? Was Mrs. Dodds a myth? So you admit there was a Mrs. Dodds? Of course. Then why? The less you knew, the fewer monsters you'd attract, Grover said, like that should be perfectly obvious. We put mist over the human's eyes. We hoped you'd think the kindly one was a hallucination. But it was no good. You started to realize who you are. Wah. Naruto cut Percy off, this isn't the time guys. I sense something coming. It's big and smells like cow. Grover had a surprised look on his face as he stared at Naruto through the rear-view mirror. He was about to ask what Naruto meant, but a weird bellowing noise rose up from behind them, closer than before. Whatever it was chasing them was still on their trail. Percy, Sally said, there's too much to explain and not enough time. We have to get you to safety. Safety from what? Who's after us? Oh, nobody much, Grover said. Just the Lord of the Dead and a few of his bloodthirstiest minions. Grover. Sorry, Mrs. Jackson. Could you drive faster, please? Sally made a hard left. They swerved onto a narrower road, racing past darkened farmhouses and wooden hills and a pick-your-own-strawberry signs with white picket fences. Where are we going? Percy asked. The summer camp I told you about. Sally's voice was tight, she was trying for my sake not to be scared. The place your father wanted to send you. The place you didn't want me to go. Naruto made a loud sigh with a hand on his face shaking his head from side to side. Please, dear, Sally begged. This is hard enough. Try to understand. Both of you are in danger. Because some old ladies cut yarn. Those weren't old ladies, weren't they? Naruto said. Those were the fates. They appear in front of you when someone is about to die. You seem to know an awful lot about this, Naruto. Grover said. I did some thinking when we were on the bus on the way to New York. I just connected the dots. Grover was dumbfounded at what Naruto said. Sally made a hard right and Naruto and Percy made out the figure she'd swerved to avoid a dark fluttering shape now lost behind them in the storm. "What was that?" Percy asked. "We're almost there," Sally said, ignoring Percy's question. "Another mile. Please. Please. Please." Outside there was nothing but rain and darkness, the kind of empty countryside you get way out on the tip of Long Island. There was a blinding flash, a jaw-rattling boom and the car exploded. "Percy! Naruto!" Sally shouted. "I'm okay." Percy groaned. "That could have gone better." Naruto managed. Actually, the car hadn't exploded, they just swerved into a ditch. The driver's side door was wedged in the mud. The roof was cut like an eggshell and rain was pouring in. Lightning, Naruto thought. "We must have been blasted off of the road." "Grover!" Percy shouted. Grover was slumped over motionless, blood trickling from the side of his mouth. Percy shook him, but he wasn't waking up any time soon. "Food," Grover groaned. Naruto chuckled. "Hee, as much as I find this funny, Grover, now is not the time." "Percy, Naruto," Sally said. "We have to." Her voice faltered. In a flash of lightning, through the mud-spattered rear windshield, they saw a figure lumbering toward them on the shoulder of the road. It was a dark silhouette of a huge guy, like a football player. He seemed to be holding a blanket over his head. His top half was bulky and fuzzy. His upraised hands made it look like he had horns. Percy gulped. "Who is?" "Percy, Naruto," my mother said in a deadly serious tone. "Get out of the car, now." Sally threw herself against the driver's side door. It was jammed shut in the mud. Percy tried his side of the door. It was stuck too. Percy looked up desperately at the hole in the roof. It might have been an exit, but the edges were sizzling and smoking. "Climb out the passenger's side." "My mother told me." "Naruto, when did you?" "No time. We have to go, now," Naruto said as he pulled Sally, Percy, and Grover out of the car. "Boys, do you see that big tree?" Sally said, pointing at the direction of the tree. Another flash of lightning, the boys saw the tree she meant, a huge, White House Christmas tree-sized pine at the crest of the nearest hill. "That's the property line," Sally said. "Get over that hill and you'll see a big farmhouse down in the valley. Run and don't look back. Yell for help. Don't stop until you reach the door. Mom, you're coming too," Percy insisted. Sally's face was pale, her eyes as set as when she looked at the ocean. "You are coming with us, Auntie Sally," Naruto shouted. "We are not leaving anyone behind." "Food," Grover moaned louder. Naruto was trying hard to control his laughter in the serious situation. The man with the blanket on his head kept coming toward them, making his grunting, snorting noises. As he got closer, they got a clear view of the thing chasing them. The thing that they thought was a blanket over his head was not a blanket at all. They were horns. The big fuzz mass that they thought was too big for his head really was his head. "He doesn't want me," Sally told Percy. "He wants you. Besides, I can't cross the property line." "But..." "No time to argue," Naruto said as he picked up Sally and firemen carried her up the hill. Percy followed her. Sally was surprised when he saw another Naruto carrying Grover at his side. Both boys glanced back. They saw what the monster really looked like. He was 7 feet tall, easy, his arms and legs were like something from the cover of Muscle Man magazine, bulging biceps and triceps and a bunch of other seps, all stuffed like baseballs under vein-webbed skin. He wore no clothes except for bright white underwear. He had coarse brown hair that started at about his belly button and got thicker as it reached his shoulders. His neck was a mass of muscle and fur leading up to his enormous head, which had a snout as long as an arm, snotty nostrils with a gleaming brass ring, cruel black eyes, and horns, enormous black and white horns with points you just couldn't get from an electric sharpener. "That's Pasiphae's son," Naruto said. "But why is he after Percy?" "But he's the min." "Don't say his name," Sally warned. "Names have power." The bullman hunched over the car, sniffing in the windows. "Food," Grover moaned. "Shhh," Naruto told him as he put a hand over Grover's mouth. "Mom, what's he doing? Doesn't he see us?" Percy asked. "His sight and hearing are terrible," she said. "He goes by smell. But he'll figure out where we are soon enough." Ruoaar. As if on cue, the bullman bellowed in rage. He picked up Gabe's Camaro by the torn roof, the chassis creaking and groaning. He raised the car over his head and threw it down the road. It slammed into the wet asphalt and skidded in a shower of sparks for about half a mile before coming to a stop. The gas tank exploded. "Percy, Naruto," Sally said. "When he sees us, he'll charge. Wait until the last second, then jump out of the way directly sideways. He can't change directions very well once he's charging. Do you understand?" "How do you know all this?" Naruto asked. "I've been worried about an attack for a long time. I should have expected this. I was selfish, keeping both of you near me. Keeping us near you? But dash." The bullman picked up their scent. He let out a huge bellow of rage and started tromping up the hill. The pine tree was only a few more yards, but the hill was getting steeper and slicker. The bullman was closing in. Another few seconds and he'd be on top of us. Percy got an idea and sprinted to the left and turned to face the creature. The minotaur was bearing down on Percy with his black eyes full of hate. Percy looked like he wanted to run away for fear of the monster. Nevertheless, he held his ground and, at the last moment, jumped to the side. The bullman stormed past Percy like a freight train, then bellowed with frustration and turned, but not toward Percy, but this time, the monster charged toward Sally, who was being set down by Naruto. They had reached the crest of the hill. Down the other side, the boys could see a valley, just as Sally described, and the lights of a farmhouse were glowing yellow through the rain. But that was half a mile away. They would never make it. The bullman grunted, pawing the ground. He kept his eyes on Sally, who was now retreating slowly downhill, back toward the road, trying to lead the monster away from the boys. "Naruto, Percy, run," she told them. "I can't go any farther. Run." Sally was running the opposite direction trying to get the bull's attention away from the boys. Percy stood frozen as the monster charged his mother. Sally tried to sidestep the bull just like what Percy did, but the bullman seemed to have learned his lesson. She was grabbed by the neck as she tried to get away. He lifted her as she struggled, kicking and pummeling the air. She caught both boys' eyes, and managed to choke out one word, "Go." With an angry roar, the monster closed his fists around Sally's neck, and she dissolved before their eyes, melting into a light, a shimmering golden form, as if she were a holographic projection. A blinding flash and she was simply gone. "Mom! Aunt Sally!" Naruto fumed with anger. He could hear a sinister laughter resonating through his head saying, "Yes, use my power." As red chakra permeated through him and his eyes flickered from the normal blue eyes to red with a vertical slit in the middle, like a fox. He placed Grover down near a tree and charged the beast. Naruto appeared near his face, catching the bullman off guard. He delivered a drop kick on his face, but the beast was able to withstand the blow because of his bulk. He went to a flurry of punches and kicks, not knowing if he was doing damage or not. The bull, on the other hand, was waving his hands trying to swat Naruto away. "This is going to be harder than I thought," he mumbled. Naruto jumped backwards to make some distance. His hands went into a blur, making a series of hand signs. "Wind style, wind scythe jutsu." The minotaur raised its hands to cover its face and brace itself for the incoming jutsu. The wind hit the bullman and sliced through it while simultaneously pushing it back. When the monster brought down its hands, it was bleeding but, unfortunately, still alive. Seeing his mother disintegrate stunned Percy and he couldn't move, but seeing Naruto attack the bullman managed to get Percy out of his state of fear. He was at a dumbfounded look as he saw Naruto moving so fast, but was more shocked when he saw that every punch and kick Naruto delivered only seemed to get the bullman angrier. Percy took off his rain jacket and waved it in the air. "Hey, stupid! Ground beef!" he shouted. Ruoaar! The monster charged Percy, shaking his meaty fists. The bullman charged too fast, his arms out to grab Percy whichever way Percy would try to dodge. Percy's legs tensed. He knew he couldn't jump sideways, so he did something the bull did not expect. He leaped straight up, kicking off the creature's head using it as a springboard, turning in midair, landing on the bullman's neck. Damn, that was awesome, Naruto thought. Percy held onto the horns until the moment of impact, which nearly knocked his teeth out. He got a good grip of the horns and pulled at the horn with all his might. Thunder and lightning were still going strong around them. Meanwhile, Grover was groaning in the grass. Percy wanted to yell at Grover to shut up, but the way the bullman was wobbling around, if Percy would open his mouth, he would bite his tongue off. Food. Grover moaned louder. The bullman was staggering about, trying to shake Percy off his head. He could hear Grover's loud moaning and began wobbling over in his direction. Naruto appeared beside Percy and Naruto locked his hands on one of the horns. Both boys realized what was happening, so they pulled harder in order to change the direction the bullman was going. The monster tensed, trying to pull into the direction it wanted to go. There was a tug of war against the two sides, with the minotaur flailing wildly like a rodeo bull until there was a loud inaudible snap. The boys fell down the back of the beast, and the bullman fell forward into another tree. Naruto looked at what he had in his hand and grinned. "Hey, beef breath!" he taunted the beast. "I got your horn right here." The beast turned towards their direction and bellowed in rage. He charged towards the blonde, ready to grab him wherever he would dodge. Naruto summoned a shadow and began forming a ball in his hand. "Percy, get ready!" Naruto shouted as he began to charge. "Giant Rasengan!" he shouted as he slammed it towards the beast's chest, causing it to skid backwards until he hit a tree. Before the jutsu hit him, the bullman managed to slam his hands towards one of the Narutos, which unfortunately was the real one. It sent him flying towards the trees close to Grover. "Percy! Finish him!" Naruto shouted as he was sent flying. Percy charged the minotaur as it hit the tree and drove the horn on its belly. The bullman roared in agony. He flailed, clawing at his chest, then began to disintegrate like crumbling sand, blown away in chunks by the wind, the same way Mrs. Dodds had burst apart. The monster was gone. The rain had stopped. The storm still rumbled, but only in the distance. Percy and Naruto smelled like livestock. Percy's head hurt so bad, but he managed to make his way towards Naruto and Grover. The satyr was still unconscious. "You don't look too good," Percy said. "Well, I've been through worse," Naruto replied, trying to get up. "Ow," he said, immediately clutching his chest. "What's wrong?" Percy began to walk towards Naruto, but he began to feel drowsy and exhausted from the encounter. Percy fell down and collapsed right next to Grover. Naruto felt the red chakra dissipate from his system, and he too began to feel exhausted. As he was about to pass out, he heard the clops of hooves approaching. He managed to make out a familiar bearded old man making his way towards them with a girl with curled golden hair who knelt next to him. "Chiron, this one's hurt." That was the last thing he heard when everything went black. Chapter 6, Kemp Half-Blood. Crash. Two boys crashed in a foot of a statue. One of the boys was wearing a navy blue, short-sleeved shirt with a high collar and an Uchiha crest on the back, white shorts. His skin was dark gray and his hair was long and dark blue. On his back, there were webbed claw-shaped wings. "This is Sasuke Uchiha." The other boy was wearing an orange and blue jacket with a white swirl tassel on the left side, and a red Uzumaki crest on the back and an orange pair of pants. There was a shroud of translucent red cloak of bubbles of red chakra forming long ears on the head area and 3 tails on the rear end. His eyes were darkened around them and his pupils were red with a slit pattern on them. His teeth also grew fangs. "This is Naruto Uzumaki." Naruto was surprised when a huge hand blocked his strike. The huge hand slapped him away, flying towards the foot of the other statue right across it. Sasuke gritted his teeth, "I have no time to waste. This body." Sasuke closed his eyes. Naruto checked his left hand. "I can't feel my left hand." "That power of yours too." "Of course there was a risk," Naruto said. Sasuke just smiled. "Do you know? This place is called the Valley of the End, the country border. This is the perfect setting, isn't it? Like I said, the time for talk is over." "Yes. That's right. The time to talk is over. Well, finally it's ending. This battle. Sasuke made the necessary hand signs Chidori. Naruto held out his right hand and a ball formed on his hand. Both boys charged, aiming their respective jutsu at each other. Both jutsu collided and exploded. A few minutes later, a tall, lovely young woman with a well-built body, shoulder-length hair and silver eyes was walking through the woods stalking an animal it had been hunting. She eventually made it to an R with a waterfall and two huge statues. She was surprised to see the destruction she saw all around the area. She spotted an orange figure lying on the ground and made her way towards it to check it out. When she made her way there, she saw a injured boy lying on his back with a pool of blood forming at his side. She was about to leave him to die, since she saw that the figure was a boy, but curiosity took over her. She knelt down to check his pulse. Her eyes went wide when she felt a pulse, but it was weak. As she was touching him, she had a vision of the boy's horrible past. She felt the resentment to people who should have accepted and the longing for acceptance he had. Her heart just melted on the spot, and, on a whim, she decided to teleport away with the boy in a bright flash of light. A familiar yellow-haired boy opens his eyes slowly to see another ceiling he has never seen before. One thing was on his mind with what he had seen. Why am I seeing this now? He heard a voice coming from the bed next to him asking, what was stolen? He decided to sit up. Your guess is as good as mine. A girl on the bed next to his was startled and almost dropped the bowl of weird pudding-like stuff she was feeding the boy on the adjacent bed, who he could make out was Percy. The girl looked to be at the same age of Percy, maybe a couple of inches taller than him, and a whole lot more athletic looking. She had a deep tan and curly blonde hair, and her eyes were startling gray, like storm clouds. Right now, she was wearing an orange shirt with a blue skirt that stopped just before the knees and blue sneakers. Don't scare me like that, she exclaimed as she watched Naruto starting to get up. Naruto felt stiff as he was getting up, but his chest didn't hurt anymore, so he could only assume that the fox had mended his injuries. He began to stretch to get rid of the kinks in his joints. How are you up? You shouldn't be awake until tomorrow at the very least, she asked with a dumbfounded look on her face. I have always been a fast healer, Naruto said. What about him? Will he be okay? Oh, yeah. He will be fine. He just needs rest. He should be up by tomorrow, Annabeth replied. That's good, Naruto said. Well, anyway, I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Nice to meet you, he said, offering a hand for a handshake with his signature smile. Annabeth looked at him slightly as if she was studying him or finding a way to take him down. She smiled and a little blush found its way onto her cheeks. She finally took her hand, shook it with the smile never leaving her face. I'm Annabeth Chase. Nice to meet you too. So, where am I? Naruto asked. You're at Kemp Half-Blood. You probably have a lot of questions. Come on, I'll take you to Chiron and Mr. D, she said, leading Naruto out of the room. On the way out, Naruto saw Greek lettering all over the walls which he somehow knew how to read. That was the medical room. You were brought in after you caused quite a bit of a ruckus last night, Annabeth explained. Yeah. Sorry about that. We wouldn't have made all that noise if not for Pasiphae's son trying to turn us into a shish kebab last night, he apologized while scratching the back of his head. You know your Greek history, she said, looking slightly impressed. My mom told me to brush up on Greek mythology when I first arrived in New York. That's a smart thing to do. What's your mother like? Annabeth said. Naruto shrugged. No, I haven't met her yet. She wanted to ask another question, but the somber look on his face made her decide not to. She found herself staring a bit longer at him, to which Naruto noticed. Is there something on my face? He asked. Annabeth immediately looked away. And nothing. Naruto was awestruck with what he saw all around him. The valley marched all the way up to the water, which glittered about a mile in the distance. The landscape was dotted with buildings that looked like ancient Greek architecture: an open-air pavilion, an amphitheater, a circular arena, except that they all looked brand new, their white marble columns sparkling in the sun. In a nearby sandpit, a dozen high school-age kids and satyrs played volleyball. Canoes glided across a small lake. Kids in bright orange t-shirts like what Annabeth was wearing were chasing each other around a cluster of cabins nestled in the woods. Some shot targets at an archery range. Others rode horses down a wooded trail, some of their horses even had wings. They made their way to the farmhouse that Naruto saw last night up on the crest of the hills. Down at the end of the porch, two men were sitting across each other playing some kind of card game. Grover noticed them approaching and trotted over towards them. "Naruto!" He shouted and gave Naruto a big hug. "Hey Annabeth!" He gave her a hug too. "Hey Grover!" Both blondes said at the same time. "It's good to see you awake after what happened." Naruto said. "Same here. Here, they found you clutching this when they found you," he said, handing a shoe box he was holding. "Thanks Grover." Naruto looked inside and saw the minotaur horn he broke off the head of the bullman the night before. Annabeth was peering in as well, curious to see what it was. Spoils of the battle," Naruto mumbled. He then looked at Grover and smiled. "Gee, thanks. Come on, Chiron would want to see you," Grover said, still excited. When they were at the porch, Naruto immediately recognized one of them to be a familiar old man in a wheelchair with thinning brown hair and a scraggly beard wearing a tweed jacket. "Mr. Brunner," Naruto said with an inquisitive look on his face. "Naruto, my boy, it's good to see you are up," Mr. Brunner greeted. "I was not expecting you until tomorrow." "Yeah, I get that a lot," he said, scratching the back of his head. "I see," Mr. Brunner responded. "How about you join us? We can play Pinnacle while we talk." Mr. Brunner motioned Naruto to sit on a chair with them in front of the table where they were playing cards. "Thank you for bringing him here, Annabeth. You can run along now," Mr. Brunner said to Annabeth. Annabeth took one last look at Naruto, jumped off the porch, and ran off. "Well, for starters, here I am called Chiron. Grover and Annabeth mentioned you while we were talking." "You mean you are the same one from the myths, the centaur who trained famous heroes like Hercules, Achilles, and Jason?" "The very same," Chiron replied. "And this here is Mr. D, our Kemp director." He was pointing at the other guy sitting on the table with them. The man was small but porky. He had a red nose, big watery eyes, and curly hair so black it was almost purple. He looked like a cherub who'd turned middle-age in a trailer park. He was wearing a tiger pattern Hawaiian shirt, and he looked like he could be one of Tsunade's drinking buddies. "This is Dionysus, known here at Kemp as Mr. D." Mr. D had an uninterested look on his face. Yes, well, welcome to camp, I guess. "I apologize for keeping everything from you, my boy." Chiron apologized. "It's just that knowing too much would attract more monsters, placing you in more danger than you already were." Chiron apologized. "It's okay, Chiron. It's just that I just wish I could have saved Aunt Sally," Naruto said with set eyes. Chiron put a hand on Naruto's shoulders and comforted the blonde. "Okay, so now here's the hard part," Chiron said. If I may make a guess, the Greek gods from the myths are real and exist to this day," Naruto said. Mr. D was beginning to take interest in the blonde. My, you seem to have an idea on what I am getting at, my boy," Chiron said. "I was told brush up on Greek mythology. Plus, I was attacked twice by things we all thought were myths at first. This couldn't have to be a coincidence." "I see." Chiron nodded. "Well, as you have said, the gods are very much alive. Over the years, they moved from country to country following Western civilization. As you have learned in Latin class, the gods come down to earth and fall in love with mortals and, sometime, if not most of the time, this love would produce a half-human, half-god offspring, a demigod," Naruto nodded. "Yes, and where we are now is Kemp Half-Blood. This Kemp is where demigods train and hone their skills, meet other demigods and form close friendships. For many, Kemp Half-Blood is a place to call home because their scents may sometime attract monsters, which makes living in the mortal world dangerous." I see. That makes sense. You seem to be taking this rather well, my boy. Well, after everything that happened, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I woke up in this world, which I did not recognize, and I thought that would be the weirdest thing I will see in my lifetime. Mr. D was being more intrigued with the conversation. In this world? What do you mean? Mr. Brunner asked, curious at Naruto's last statement. Since you're being straightforward with me, I should be honest with you. Naruto said. I am from another world where the people use energy, known as chakra, to manipulate the elements and perform amazing feats. Chiron and Grover looked at Naruto, speechless at what the blonde said. Only Mr. D was able to speak. Do you mean you are from the elemental nations? Naruto nodded. This isn't true. You must be lying. Mr. D said. Naruto just shook his head. He held out his hand and formed a Rasengan. Grover gasped at the sight. Yep, that is chakra all right. Mr. D said, now amused. I must say, this is a first. We have never had anybody from the elemental nations here before. But that doesn't explain why you are able to enter, since you said you were taken in. If you were a regular mortal, you wouldn't be able to enter the borders, much less see this area. Naruto nodded. I woke up in an apartment with a note from someone who said she is taking me as her own. That makes sense. Only the gods are capable of traversing different worlds. Well, what's important is that you are safe here in camp. Chiron added. Wait. Hold on. What are the elemental nations? What is chakra? And what is that blue thing Naruto has made? Well, Grover. Naruto was about to explain to Grover everything, when Mr. D mumbled, I am going to need a drink for this. Then, with a wave of a hand, he summoned a glass of wine. Thunder boomed. Mr. D, your restrictions. Chiron reminded while he was looking at his cards. Mr. D looked at the wine and feigned surprise. Oh dear me. Old habits. Sorry. Thunder boomed again. He waved his hand again and the glass of wine changed into a fresh can of Diet Coke. He sighed unhappily, popped open the top of the soda, and went back to the card game. Wait. Wine. You must be Dionysus, god of wine. Naruto exclaimed after seeing what Mr. D did. That is correct. Nice to see not demigods who come here are complete idiots. Thanks, I guess. I'm sorry, Lord Dionysus. I should have realized sooner. Naruto apologized with a slight bow. I suppose that is fine, boy. I wouldn't expect anyone to recognize me with this look I have chosen to look as while I am here. Mr. said, his respect for the blonde climbing a little bit. Naruto thanked Mr. D and turned back to Grover. Sorry about that, Grover. Anyways. Naruto went on to explain everything about the elemental nations and chakra to Grover the way it was explained to him when he was studying in the academy. By the end of it, Grover was left dumbfounded and completely gobsmacked at the new information given to him. To think a world like that existed. Who knew? He said, slumping back. Naruto put a hand on Grover and said, that is exactly what I felt when I came into this world. Grover's nose twitched when he smelled the familiar smell he always smelled when he was with him in Yancey Academy. He decided to ask, you know. I have always wondered why you smell like a fox. Naruto was taken aback by the question. His expression darkened. Grover. It's okay, Naruto. You can trust him. Chiron put a hand on Naruto. I think all of you should hear this. Naruto took a deep breath and began to explain. There are these huge masses of chakra who have taken a living form. These creatures are as tall as a New York skyscraper. There are 9 of these massive creatures, each differentiated by their number of tails. The nations in my world have found the way to seal them inside humans to harness their powers. They are called the Jinchuriki. One of them is sealed inside of me. Naruto continued, clutching his stomach. The 9-tailed fox. This gained the attention of the wine god, who almost choked on his Diet Coke. You mean you are the Jinchuriki of the 9-tailed fox? Mr. D stood up and made his way to Naruto. Let me see the seal. Naruto lifted his shirt and channeled chakra through his body. After a few seconds, the seal appeared on his stomach. Mr. D kneeled over and examined the seal. I must say, this is quite a seal. In my time going over there to taste some of the wine in your world, I happened to come across a scroll of the sealing arts left by a random drunk mortal. I tried to study it. I may not be seal master, myself, but I can spot a good seal when I see one. Whoever made this seal was a genius. It is something my sister, Athena, would be jealous over. Naruto nodded. This could be troublesome. I should keep an eye on you, since we have never had a shinobi at camp, much less a Jinchuriki. I doubt you will have some episodes since the seal is doing its job at keeping the beast at bay. But we can never be too careful, we don't need a giant fox terrorizing the place. Naruto nodded in understanding while Mr. D explained to Kirin what a Jinchuriki was. Naruto turned to his friend. He raised the box beside him and said, I got to thank you again for this. It's the least I can do, since you and Percy saved me. Grover said, his expression turned downtrodden. I have protected you better, all of you. Kirin patted Grover on the back and said, Grover, you did a good job. That's 2 more that you have brought to safety. It should have been 5. He whispered to himself. Grover, why don't you take Naruto on a tour of camp? I'm sure he is eager to see what is around. Sure, Kirin. He said, getting up and motioned Naruto to follow. I'll see you guys later. Naruto said. When both boys left, Naruto left his cards and the paper where he tallied the points. Mr. D and Kirin became wide-eyed when they saw Naruto's score was way higher than theirs. On the tour around camp. That building where we were just now is the big house. It's basically the HQ of Kemp and where Kirin and Mr. D hang out to play pinochle. Grover explained. Naruto nodded as he looked around. They passed by several campers carrying either bows and arrows, swords, or other assorted weapons. Others had maps or books while others carried tools. Several campers nudged each other when they saw Naruto. Another whispered to his companion, that's him, one of the 2 from last night. Most of the campers he saw were older than the blonde. There were satyrs bigger than Grover, but all were wearing Kemp half-blood t-shirts, with nothing else to cover their goat halves. There were those staring at him like how Annabeth did. Others were trying to figure Naruto out. Some of them, specifically the girls, were staring at him with stars in their eyes. They walked through the strawberry fields where there were kids were picking bushels of strawberries while a satyr was playing a tune on his reed pipes. Naruto took a whiff of the area and found that he was sighing happily. The place smelled heavenly. It smelled of freshly cut grass and smell of strawberries permeated through the air. Grover explained that the children of Demeter took up the task of keeping the strawberry fields in good condition along with the satyrs playing magical songs to help them grow. He also added that the strawberries helped pay the funds of the camp. It may have been a magical camp for demigods, but it still needed money from the mortal world. So, Grover, how were you assigned to find me and Percy? Naruto asked, striking a conversation with his satyr friend. I wasn't exactly assigned to find you. Grover replied. Satyrs are sent out to the mortal world to find demigods and bring them back to camp safely. Yancey Academy was my second chance. Second chance? You mean you did this before? He said, getting a solemn look from Grover. Yeah, a couple of years ago, but I rather not talk about it. Let's just say something went wrong along the way. Grover was sad for a moment, but he shook it off and continued, anyways, I was sent to Yancey Academy to look for half-bloods, then it just so happened that you and Percy were studying there. Originally, I thought that it was just Percy, and then I discovered you. That's when I called Kirin and he came to Yancey as well. Why, was something the matter? Grover shook his head, no, not necessarily. It's just that you and Percy were giving off a strong scent, stronger than other demigods, though, yours may be because you're a shinobi and a Jinchuriki. Blah. Man, that's weird, I still can't believe that a world like that exists. You have to tell me more sometimes. Sure, man. Naruto said with a smile. And Grover, I would appreciate that you wouldn't tell anyone about the fox part. I just think people would take it the wrong way and... I don't blame you, Grover said. From what Mr. D had said, most people would be cautious. But you and Percy saved me, and I spent a lot of time with you to know that you can be trusted. Thanks, man. Naruto replied. After the strawberry fields, They went past the archery range where a large group of children of varying ages were firing arrows at targets. They seemed pretty good since most were hitting just around the center. Grover showed Naruto the Pegasus stables, the forges, the circular arena, the archery field, the canoeing lake, the open-air pavilion where the campers eat at their assigned tables, and the amphitheater where the campers have a campfire, tell stories, and sing songs. Naruto loved all of them, especially the Pegasus stables where he saw a beautiful girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. They made eye contact and smiled at each other. Naruto was about to go follow her, but Grover pulled him, saying that there was a lot more to see. Naruto asked Grover about the woods around camp. Grover said that it was stocked with monsters that the campers can go and hunt. Naruto said it might be fun and that it was a good thing he brought his bag of kunai and shuriken. Grover shook his head and said that monsters could only be killed with celestial bronze, much to the disappointment of the blonde. Grover made him feel better by saying that they can visit the forges. Finally, they made their way to the cabins. There were 12 of them nestled in the woods by the lake. They were arranged in a U, with 2 at the base and 5 in a row of either side. Not a single cabin had the same design, except for a brass number placed above the door. Cabin 1 and 2 were the only ones with almost the same design. They looked like his and hers mausoleums, big white marble boxes with heavy columns in front. Cabin 1 was the biggest and bulkiest of the 12. Its polished bronze doors shimmered like a hologram, so that from different angles lightning bolts seemed to streak across them. Cabin 2 was more graceful somehow, with slimmer columns garlanded with pomegranates and flowers. The walls were carved with images of peacocks. Number 9 had smokestacks, like a tiny factory. Number 4 had tomato vines on the walls and a roof made out of real grass. 7 seemed to be made of solid gold, which gleamed so much in the sunlight it was almost impossible to look at. They all faced a commons area about the size of a soccer field, dotted with Greek statues, fountains, flower beds, and a couple of basketball hoops. In the center of the field was a huge stone-lined fire pit. Even though it was a warm afternoon, the hearth smoldered. A girl about 9 years old was tending the flames, poking the coals with a stick. She had brown hair with a small bandana covering her hair and wore a brown dress that went down to her knees. She turned to Naruto and gave him a smile. She then walked into the flames and disappeared. Grover explained that each cabin represents one of the 12 Olympians and houses the demigod children of that said god. Naruto noticed that some cabins were empty and asked, "Why are there cabins that are empty?" "Well, cabin 2 is empty because Hera is the goddess of marriage, so she doesn't have affairs, so no demigod children. The cabin's just ordinary. Cabin 1 and 3 are empty because the big 3, Zeus, Poseidon and Hades, had a pact to have no more demigod children due to some bad past events. Cabin 8 is empty because Artemis took an oath, along with Athena and Hestia, to remain a virgin, so no demigod children. Her cabin's mostly honorary." "Mostly honorary?" Naruto asked. "Yeah," Grover nodded. "From time to time, the hunters of Artemis, her handmaidens, sometimes visit camp. When they're here, they sleep there." Naruto stared at cabin 8 and felt like something was telling him to go there, but he ignored it. "What about children of the other gods?" "They just stay at cabin 11. Naruto frowned. "Won't that make the cabin overflow with campers?" "Yeah," Grover nodded, "but Hermes is the god of travelers, so they accept anyone to stay there, even the unclaimed." As they were talking, a girl who had been staring at them from the cabin with barbed wires on the roof and a stuffed boar on the doorway approached them with 2 other bulky boys. "Hey, Blondie. That's it for part 1. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.